The sun sank lazily behind the neat rows of houses in suburban Chicago, casting a soft golden glow across the street that reflected off white picket fences and manicured lawns. Inside the Wilson home, a two-story cottage with blue shutters and a porch covered in clematis, the bustle of the evening was the usual pre-dinner bustle. Claire Wilson, dressed in an elegant mustard-colored dress that she had selected from her closet with almost mechanical precision, stood at the kitchen island, slicing tomatoes for a salad. The blade of her knife tapped rhythmically on the cutting board, creating a soothing rhythm that couldn't drown out the growing hum in her head. It wasn't a noise, but more of a feeling as if someone were slowly turning up the volume on her own thoughts until they began to drown out everything else. Claire was beautiful, but not in the flashy way that made heads turn on the street. Her chestnut brown hair, slightly curled at the ends, was pulled back into a loose bun, and her gray-green eyes, framed by fine lines, betrayed a weariness she had learned to hide behind a smile. At 38, she looked younger than her age, but she felt as if she had lived several lifetimes. A career in marketing for a major Chicago company, 2 children, a husband who was the picture of stability, all of it should have made her happy. And yet, as she stood at the stove, a pan of chicken sizzling, she felt something tightening inside her, as if someone invisible were tightening a knot. "Mom, did you forget the basil again?" The voice of Emma, her 14-year-old daughter, wafted into the kitchen like a light breeze, full of teenage insolence. Emma stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, as if guarding the sacred territory of her own righteousness. Her long dark hair was neatly braided, with strands of it stubbornly escaping, despite her best efforts, to frame her face. Her gray-green eyes glowed beneath thin, well-defined eyebrows, with a sharp, slightly mocking squint, a look she'd spent the last couple of years honing like a jeweler. She wore a loose plaid button-down over a t-shirt with some rock band logo on it, and distressed jeans, her signature teenage style, carefully chosen to appear casual. She held her phone in one hand and a wilted basil leaf in the other as physical evidence of her mother's incompetence. Claire looked up from the board and smiled, though it was a little forced. "Basil in the salad, Em. Don't start, okay? It's a special night." Emma rolled her eyes, but the corners of her lips twitched in a tiny smile. "Yeah, I know. This is the third time Dad's checked the glasses to make sure they're dusty. He's so predictable." Claire laughed, but it was more for Emma than for herself. David, her husband, was indeed predictable in the best sense of the word. An engineer with a romantic soul, he always remembered dates, planned family dinners, and even bought flowers for no reason. Today was their 16th wedding anniversary, and David, as usual, made it an event. The living room table was covered with a white tablecloth, a bouquet of roses sat in the center, and the soft sounds of Frank Sinatra, his invariable choice for such evenings, were coming from an old record player. David emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a linen towel. Tall and slightly hunched over a man accustomed to spending hours in front of blueprints and screens, he wore soft lounge pants and a light gray sweater, slightly rolled up at the sleeves. His hair, already streaked with gray, was slightly tousled, and there was a warm, slightly shy smile on his face. He wore thin-rimmed glasses, which he always forgot to take off, even when he wasn't reading. His gaze held the same softness and attention that had once captivated Claire, the ability to listen, to see, and to be there without making a big deal out of it. He noticed Emma at the door and cast a mischievous glance at her. "Basil. I was sure it was in the fridge. Maybe it evaporated in honor of the anniversary." "Lucas, don't touch the pie." Claire turned to her youngest son, 10-year-old Lucas, who was standing on his tiptoes trying to steal a piece of cherry pie from the kitchen table. His round, freckled face broke into an apologetic smile, and he immediately retreated, raising his hands in surrender. "I was just watching, Mom." Lucas giggled and ran into the living room, where he was already fiddling with the Lego sets scattered across the floor. Claire shook her head, but something tugged at her chest. She loved them, her children, her home, her life. But somehow, with each passing day, that love grew heavier, as if someone were adding more and more obligations until she was suffocating. She looked at her reflection in the glass oven door. Her dress neat, her hair perfect, but her eyes gave it all away. They were tired, empty, as if someone had turned off the light inside. The door slammed and David walked into the kitchen, holding a bottle of wine. His blonde hair was slightly tousled, and his shirt, tucked into his trousers, looked like it had taken him half an hour to achieve the perfect casualness. He smiled at Claire, his blue eyes as warm as ever. "Well, Mrs. Wilson, are you ready for our big night?" He stepped closer, wrapped his arms around her waist, and kissed her temple. His touch was familiar, comforting, but Claire felt her body tense, as if resisting this closeness. "I am, Mr. Wilson," she replied, trying to put playfulness into her voice. "But if you choose the same toast as last year again, I will officially file for divorce." David laughed, and his laughter filled the kitchen like sunlight. "Oh, I've come up with a new one. I promise you'll love it." Claire nodded, turning back to her salad, but her mind was already wandering. She thought about how easily David accepted their life, how content he was with this rhythm work, family, Friday night dinners. And she felt like an actress who had been playing the same role for so long that she had forgotten who she really was. The evening began as expected, perfectly. The guests, their closest friends, and a few relatives filled the living room with laughter and conversation. Linda Carter, Claire's best friend, sat at the head of the table, the center of attention as always. Her red hair glowed in the candlelight, and her loud laughter echoed around the room like the clinking of glasses. Linda had been divorced for 2 years, and her energy, a mixture of freedom and a touch of bitterness, always acted like a magnet for Claire. "Claire, you have to tell them about that ad campaign." Linda raised her glass of wine, her eyes glittering. "How did you convince the client to invest $1 million in that crazy drone idea? You're a genius." Claire smiled, but her cheeks flushed slightly. She didn't like being the center of attention, although she was a master of persuasion at work. "It was a team effort, Lynn, and honestly, I'm still not sure how we pulled it off." "Oh, don't be modest." Linda leaned closer, lowering her voice so no one but Claire could hear. "You deserve better than sitting in an office coming up with yogurt slogans. You could, I don't know, take over the world." Claire laughed, but Linda's words struck a chord deep inside. Deserved more. What did that even mean? She glanced at David, who was telling their neighbor a story about how Lucas had accidentally launched a drone into their neighbor's pool. Everyone was laughing, and Claire suddenly felt like an outsider. This was her life, her people, but why did she feel like she was looking through glass? Emma, sitting across from her, caught her eye. The girl narrowed her eyes, as if trying to figure out what her mother was thinking. Claire quickly looked away, afraid that her daughter would see too much. Emma had always been too observant for her age. Sometimes Claire felt as if her daughter knew more about her than she did. To 16 years of love, laughter, and patience. David raised his glass, and his voice brought Claire out of her reverie. The guests laughed, and Claire forced herself to smile, raising her glass. "Claire, you are my compass, my home. Without you, I would be lost." The toast was sincere, and the guests applauded, but Claire felt her throat tighten. She drank the wine in one gulp, hoping the alcohol would drown out this strange feeling she couldn't name. Love, wine, or something else entirely? As the guests began to leave, Claire stepped out onto the veranda to breathe in the cool evening air. The sky was full of stars, and the street, so familiar, seemed almost unreal in its silence. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the chill creeping under the thin fabric of her dress. Tired, Linda appeared next to him, holding another glass of wine. Her eyes, as always, sparkled with mischief, but there was something else in them, too understanding, almost sympathy. "A little," Claire said, looking up at the stars. "It's just, sometimes it feels like I'm running in place." Linda nodded, as if she'd been waiting for these words. "Oh, honey, I know that feeling. After my divorce, I thought freedom was all I needed. But freedom, it's like wine. It gets you drunk, and then it leaves you with a hangover." Claire looked at her friend, trying to figure out if she was joking or serious. Linda was always like that, a mix of cynicism and wisdom wrapped in a colorful package. "Do you ever regret leaving Mark?" Claire asked, almost in a whisper. Linda thought, turning the glass in her hands. "Sometimes, but not because I loved him. Because I had to relearn how to be myself. You feel that too, right? Like you're not you, but someone else's version of you." Claire didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. She thought of David, the way he'd hugged her today, the way Lucas had laughed at his jokes, the way Emma had looked at her with suspicion. This was her life, beautiful, neat, like a postcard. But why did she feel as if the postcard belonged to someone else? "Claire," Linda put her hand on her shoulder, "you deserve to be happy, not just content. Happy. If you need to change something, do it. Life's too short to pretend." Claire nodded, but something inside her tightened even more. Change. The word sounded so simple, but it was so scary. She looked at the house, where the warm light was burning, and wondered, what if happiness wasn't something she had, but something she'd never tasted? When Claire returned to the house, David was already putting away the dishes, humming under his breath. Lucas was asleep on the couch, hugging a pillow, and Emma was sitting in the corner with her phone, her face illuminated by the screen. Claire paused in the doorway, looking at this picture. She wanted to go to David, to hug him, to tell him she loved him, but something inside her that damn knot was holding her back. "Are you okay?" David turned to her, drying his hands on a towel. His voice was soft, but there was a hint of worry in his eyes. "Yeah, I'm just tired," Claire lied, forcing a smile. "I'm going to take a shower." She walked upstairs, feeling each step echo in her chest. In the bathroom, she turned on the water, letting steam fill the room, and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her was a stranger. Beautiful, successful, but a stranger. Claire closed her eyes and thought about Linda's words. "You deserve more. But what is more, and at what cost?" At that moment, standing under the hot water, Claire didn't know that her life was about to change. She didn't know that a chance meeting at a company party, a few words from a stranger, would turn everything upside down. She didn't know that tomorrow she would start lying to herself, to her family, to her reflection. But somewhere deep inside, in that very knot that squeezed her heart, she felt that this evening was the last time her life was a perfect frame. Tomorrow the frame will begin to crack. The noise of Chicago's city life was lost in the soft hum of air conditioning in the ballroom of the Drake Hotel. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light off polished parquet floors, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, mingled with hints of champagne and fresh-cut lilies. Claire Wilson stood by a tall window, looking out at the twinkling lights of Michigan Avenue, distant stars lost in the concrete sky. Her black sheath dress, chosen with careful precision, emphasized her slender figure, but she felt out of place. Her company's corporate parties were always a mix of ostentatious opulence and hidden tension, a place where coworkers smiled at each other with hidden ambitions and bosses handed out praise like Halloween candy. Claire clutched a glass of white wine, more for show than pleasure. She had already played her part, shaking hands with the right people, laughing at her boss's jokes, complimenting the new advertising campaign her team had launched for the coffee chain. Now she could afford a moment of solitude, watching the crowd. The people around her seemed like actors in a well-rehearsed performance. Smiles, toasts, light touches on elbows, all part of the ritual. But inside, Claire was itching, like an old wound she didn't dare touch. "You don't look like you're enjoying the party," a voice, low and slightly mocking, broke into her thoughts. Claire turned and met the gaze of a young man standing a few feet away. He was dressed in a black waiter's uniform, white shirt, black waistcoat, bow tie, but there was something about his posture that made him stand out from the crowd. Maybe it was the slight casualness with which he held the tray of canapés, or the way his dark hair fell over his forehead, as if he deliberately neglected to comb it. But what struck Claire most were his eyes, brown with golden sparkles that seemed to see more than she was willing to let on. "I'm just taking a break from talking about K-pies and deadlines," Claire replied, smiling slightly. She was surprised at how easily the words came out, even though she usually avoided talking to strangers. The man grinned, his smile both cheeky and warm. I see. These parties are like a circus, only instead of clowns, there are people in $3,000 suits. He held out a tray. Canapes, shrimp and mango. Sounds weird, but it tastes okay. Claire took the appetizer, more out of politeness than hunger. Do you always speak so frankly to your guests? Only the ones who look like they want to run away, he replied, narrowing his eyes. I'm Matt, by the way. Matt Crow. Claire, she nodded, feeling her cheeks warm slightly. And I'm not going to run away. I'm just pausing. Matt tilted his head as if studying her. A pause is good. But, sometimes pauses lead to the most interesting moments. Claire felt her heart skip a beat. His words were simple, but there was a genuine audacity to them that made her feel alive for the first time in a long time. She wanted to say something witty, but instead she just smiled and took a sip of wine. The conversation with Matt went on longer than she expected. He told her he waited tables to pay the rent on his small West Loop studio where he painted. His paintings, he said, were somewhere between chaos and a dream, abstract, bright, full of energy. Claire listened, captivated not so much by his words as by the way he spoke, with a slight rasp, pausing to give her time to feel each word. He wasn't like the people she usually hung out with. There was something wild about his manner, as if he lived by his own rules, not caring what anyone thought. What about you? Matt asked, setting the tray down on the table and crossing his arms. What does Claire do when she's not partying? She laughed, but it sounded a little nervous. I'm a marketer. I create ads that make people buy things they might not need. Wow, Matt raised an eyebrow. So you're a master at convincing people to want things they don't want. Claire felt a prick. His words were meant as a joke, but they touched something inside her. Sometimes, she said, looking into her glass, and sometimes I don't know what I want. Matt looked at her with unexpected seriousness. That's okay. Most people don't know. But you look like you're ready to find out. Claire froze. His gaze was too penetrating, too close to the truth. She wanted to protest, to say that she had it all under control, that her life was picture perfect, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she changed the subject, asking about his paintings, and Matt began enthusiastically describing his latest work, a huge canvas covered in bright dabs of red and blue. His hands moved through the air, describing shapes and lines, and Claire found herself looking at his fingers, long and slightly stained with paint despite the neatness of his uniform. As the party went on, Claire found herself unable to focus on her co-workers. She found herself looking for Matt, noticing how he maneuvered deftly between guests, serving drinks or clearing empty plates. Every time their eyes met, he smiled slightly, and that smile was like a spark, igniting something inside her. Claire tried to convince herself that this was just a flirtation, nothing serious. She was married, she had a family, a career, a life. But the longer she stood in that room, surrounded by people who knew her as Claire Wilson Marketer, the more she felt like she wanted to be someone else at least for one night. When Matt was there again, offering her a glass of champagne, she made up her mind. Tell me more about your paintings. Where do you paint them? In my studio, he answered, his eyes lighting up. It's not exactly a palace, but there's light and freedom. Do you want to see it? Claire froze. It wasn't just a question, it was an invitation, subtle but obvious. She knew she should say no, smile, and go back to her role. But instead, she heard herself say, surprisingly firm, maybe, someday. Matt smiled, and there was something in that smile that made her feel both vulnerable and strong. I'll remember, Claire. Someday is a start. By the time Claire got home, the night had settled over the suburbs in a soft blanket of silence. The Wilsons' house was asleep, and only the dim light from the television in the living room indicated that David had probably dozed off before she returned. She took off her shoes, feeling the cold of the wooden floor penetrate her feet, and went into the kitchen. There, standing at the sink with a glass of water, She closed her eyes and allowed herself to think of Matt. His voice, his gaze, his hands covered in paint. It was stupid, ridiculous even, but she couldn't stop the flow of her thoughts. She imagined his studio small, cluttered, smelling of paint and coffee, canvases scattered across the floor. She imagined him painting, his movements full of passion, the way he looked at her as if he saw more than just a woman in a black dress. Claire opened her eyes and looked at her reflection in the dark window. She was still Claire Wilson, wife, mother, professional. But somewhere inside, in the deepest corner of her soul, a spark had ignited. She didn't know what to do with it, but she felt like it could become a flame or burn down everything she'd worked so hard to build. She lay down in bed next to David, who was snoring softly, hugging his pillow. His face, even in sleep, was calm, reliable, like a beacon in a storm. But Claire couldn't sleep. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Matt, about his words, about the way he'd called her by her first name, Claire. Not Mrs. Wilson, not Mom, not coworker, just Claire. And there was something about that simple word that made her feel alive. The next morning, she woke up determined to forget about the night before. It had been a chance encounter, a brief flirtation, nothing more. She made breakfast for the kids, kissed David before he left for work, smiled at Emma, who was, as usual, grumbling about school. But by lunchtime, sitting in her office, surrounded by spreadsheets and presentations, Claire found herself searching the internet for local art shows. She wouldn't admit it, even to herself, but somewhere deep down she was hoping to find the name Matt Crow. Rain pounded the sidewalks of the West Loop, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected neon signs and the silhouettes of people hurrying under umbrellas. Claire Wilson sat by the window at Bean and Brew, a small place with worn wooden tables and the smell of freshly ground coffee that mingled with the dampness that had drifted in from the street. She held a latte in her hand, but she drank it more out of habit than pleasure. Her eyes were glued to her laptop, where a spreadsheet with data from a new advertising campaign was open, but her mind was elsewhere, memories of the office party, of Matt Crow's voice, of his gaze that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed mask. She hadn't planned to look for him. At least, that's what she told herself when she decided to leave the office on her lunch break and stop by this cafe, which just happened, or maybe not so coincidentally, to be in the area where Matt had mentioned his studio. Claire told herself she just needed a break, a breath of air, a break from the endless calls and emails. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't looking for coffee, she was looking for a chance, however remote, to run into him again. "I didn't think marketers drank coffee in places like this," a familiar voice said, low and slightly husky, making her jump. Claire looked up to see Matt standing at her table. He was wearing a tattered leather jacket, wet from the rain, and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His hair, slightly longer than she remembered, was plastered to his forehead, and he held a paper cup of coffee in his hands. His smile was the same, cheeky, but with a warmth that made it disarming. "So marketers are only supposed to drink Starbucks," Claire replied, trying to hide the way her heart suddenly started beating faster. She closed her laptop as if that would hide her nervousness. Matt laughed and sat down across from her without asking. "No, you just look a little too elegant for this place." He nodded at her cream trench coat and the neatly styled hair she'd spent half an hour tidying that morning. "But you know, it suits you." Claire felt her cheeks flush slightly, and she scolded herself. She was 38, married, with 2 children. She shouldn't blush at the compliments of some artist who was probably 6 years her junior. But Matt was looking at her as if she were the only person in this cafe, in this city, in this world. And the sensation of being seen was so new, so intoxicating, that she couldn't look away. "Do you come here often?" she asked, to fill the pause that had suddenly become too heavy. "Almost every day," Matt said, sipping his coffee. "My studio is 2 blocks away. It's my lifeline when I can't stand to look at my canvases anymore. What about you? What brings you to the West Loop?" Claire hesitated. She could have told the truth that she'd chosen this cafe because it was close to his studio, that somewhere deep down she'd been hoping for this meeting. But instead, she shrugged and lied. Needed a break. Tired of the office. Matt nodded, but there was a glint in his eye, like he knew more than she was letting on. A break is good. Want to see where I work? My studio isn't exactly a masterpiece, but it has worse coffee than this one, and a few paintings you might like. The invitation hung in the air like a thin thread that Claire could either snap or pull. She knew she should say no. She had a meeting in an hour, a report due tomorrow, and a family waiting for her at home. But the word no stuck somewhere in her throat, and instead she heard herself say, surprisingly calm, "Why not, as long as it doesn't take too long?" Matt smiled, and there was something triumphant in it, as if he had won the first round of a game whose rules Claire did not yet understand. "I promise I won't keep you long." Matt's studio was on the top floor of an old brick building, reached by a narrow staircase with peeling paint. The air smelled of damp and paint thinner, and the wooden floorboards creaked underfoot. When Matt opened the door, Claire paused in the doorway, struck by the contrast between the chaos inside and her own life, where everything was neatly organized. The walls were stained with paint, and the floor was littered with scraps of paper and empty coffee cans. In the center of the room sat an easel with an unfinished canvas, bright strokes of red and purple merging into something resembling a storm. Light poured in through the huge window, filling the space with the cold glow of an overcast day. "Welcome to my world," Matt said, taking off his jacket and tossing it onto a chair. He walked over to the small table where the coffee maker sat and began fiddling with it as if it were the most natural thing to do. "Don't mind the mess. It's part of the process." Claire stepped inside, feeling both alien and fascinated. She walked over to a canvas leaning against the wall, a huge canvas covered in layers of blue and gold paint that gave the illusion of movement, as if waves were crashing on an invisible shore. "Is this your work?" she asked, her eyes still on the painting. "Yeah," Matt said, stepping closer. "Call it capturing the moment. You know when you feel something so strongly it almost hurts? I'm trying to hold on to it." Claire turned to look at him, and their eyes met. He was standing too close, and she could smell his cologne, something tart and woodsy. Her heart began to pound so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "Do you often catch moments like this?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Sometimes," Matt replied, his voice quieter, almost intimate. "What about you? When was the last time you felt something real?" The question caught her off guard. Claire wanted to say something light, but the words wouldn't come. She thought of David, his kind smile, the way he hugged her in the morning. She thought of the children, of Emma looking at her suspiciously, of Lucas laughing at her jokes. It was real, wasn't it? But why did she feel so empty? "I don't know," she said finally, and there was such honesty in her voice that she surprised herself. "Maybe I've forgotten what it's like." Matt looked at her for a long time, too long, and Claire felt the air between them thicken. She knew she should leave, but her feet were rooted to the floor. And then he took a step closer, and his hand touched her elbow, a light, almost weightless touch, but it burned her like a spark. "Do you want to know?" he asked, and there was no mockery in his voice, only a quiet, dangerous sincerity. Claire didn't answer. She just stood there, looking into his eyes, and felt something inside her crumble, not the walls, but the thin threads that held her life together. And then, without thinking, without allowing herself to think, she leaned toward him, and their lips met. The kiss was not what she expected. It was hungry, almost desperate, as if they were both trying to prove something to themselves, to each other, to the world. Claire felt her body respond, every cell coming alive, as if awakening from a long sleep. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, and Matt responded, holding her close as if he were afraid she would disappear. There was nothing of Claire's neat, safe life in this moment. It was chaos, a storm, and she wanted to drown in it. They pulled away, breathing heavily, and Claire looked at Matt, trying to understand what had just happened. His eyes were dark and full of desire, but there was a hint of uncertainty in them, as if he himself hadn't expected things to go this far. "Claire," he began, but she shook her head. "No need," she said, taking a step back. I need to go." She grabbed her trench coat and almost ran out of the studio without looking back. The rain lashed her face, but she barely noticed it. Her thoughts were in turmoil, and her heart was pounding as if it was trying to escape her chest. What had she done? It was just a kiss, nothing serious, nothing irreversible. But why did she feel like she was flying and falling into an abyss at the same time? That evening, Claire returned home later than she had promised. She called David and lied, said she had been late at work, that a client had requested urgent revisions to a presentation. Her voice sounded calm, but when she hung up, she felt her throat tighten with shame. The lie was so simple, so natural, that it was frightening. At home, everything was as usual. Lucas was watching a cartoon, Emma was on her phone, and David was cooking dinner pasta with sauce, which he made using his secret recipe. He greeted Claire with a smile, kissed her on the cheek, and asked how her day was. Claire answered something unintelligible, avoiding his gaze. She felt like an actress playing someone else's role, and she was afraid that David would notice a crack in her mask. After dinner, when the children had gone to their rooms, Claire was sitting on the sofa, pretending to read a book. David sat down next to her, putting his hand on her back. "Are you okay, honey?" he asked, and his voice was so soft, so caring, that Claire wanted to cry. "I'm just tired," she replied, forcing a smile. "Work, you know?" He nodded, but there was a hint of worry in his eyes. "You're taking on too much. Maybe we should take a few days off?" Claire shook her head, feeling the guilt growing in her chest like a weed she couldn't pull out. She kissed him, hoping it would drown out her thoughts, but it was mechanical, lacking the passion she'd felt with Matt. And that was the worst part, the realization that she couldn't pretend her life was enough anymore. That night, Claire lay awake, staring into the darkness. She thought about Matt, about his studio, about the way his hands had touched her. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't stop. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that this kiss wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a journey that would change everything. And despite the fear and the guilt, part of her wanted to keep going, to see where it would lead. The autumn wind whipped fallen leaves down the street, swirling them before settling on the neatly trimmed lawns of suburban Chicago. The Wilson household, usually a cozy family home, was unusually quiet today. Emma Wilson, a 14-year-old with a keen eye for detail, sat on the windowsill of her room, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her long dark hair, pulled back into a loose braid, brushed the glass as it began to rain. Her headphones were nearby, but the music that usually drowned out her thoughts was not helping. Emma frowned, going over in her mind the oddities she had noticed in her mother's behavior over the past few weeks. Claire, always so organized, punctual, with her perfectly ironed blouses and her schedule, seemed different now. She would forget to pick up Lucas from soccer practice, or she would suddenly become unusually animated, humming tunes Emma had never heard before. Sometimes her mother would stare into space, as if her thoughts were elsewhere, and then, catching Emma's eye, she would smile too brightly to be genuine. Emma couldn't explain why this bothered her so much, but her intuition, honed by her teenage sensitivity, told her that something was wrong. Emma jumped down from the windowsill and headed toward the kitchen, where Claire was preparing dinner. The smell of roasting garlic and rosemary filled the air, and the radio played an old Bruce Springsteen hit softly. Claire stood at the stove, stirring a saucepan, but her movements were mechanical, as if she were performing the task on autopilot. She wore a loose shirt rolled up to her elbows and jeans that Emma hadn't seen her mother wear in years. It wasn't the style she was accustomed to. Claire usually opted for sharp suits or elegant dresses. Emma paused in the doorway, crossing her arms, and cleared her throat to get her attention. "Mom, you forgot to buy milk again," she said, deliberately adding a note of irritation to her voice. It wasn't a real reproach, but more of a trial balloon to test the reaction. Claire jumped, as if she'd been plucked from another world, and turned around. Her eyes, gray-green with fine lines at the corners, looked momentarily confused, but she smiled quickly. "Oh, really? Sorry, Em. I'll get some tomorrow, I promise." She turned back to the stove, but Emma saw her hand tighten on her spoon. "You don't remember anything lately," Emma continued, coming closer and leaning on the kitchen island. The milk and almost leaving Lucas in the field. What's wrong with you? Claire laughed, but it was taut, like a string about to snap. You know, adult life, work, home, lots to do. Sometimes your head gets a little overwhelmed. She glanced quickly at her daughter, as if to see if she was buying the explanation. Emma narrowed her eyes. She hated it when adults talked to her like she didn't understand. Work, huh? Then why do you come home late and smell like you've been in some? She hesitated, searching for the word. Some weird place, not an office like paint or something. Claire froze. Her hand holding the spoon paused in midair, and for a split second Emma saw something like panic in her expression. But her mother recovered, set the spoon down on the table, and turned to her daughter with a smile that was almost convincing. Paint? You've been reading too many detective stories. I was in the office, then stopped by the print shop, checking layouts for a new campaign. It always smells of chemicals there. Emma didn't believe a word of it. She knew what a printing shop smelled like, a sharp, almost metallic odor, not the warm, tart scent she'd picked up on her mother's clothes a few days ago. But instead of arguing, she simply nodded, deciding that a direct assault wouldn't work for now. Okay, whatever, she muttered, and left the kitchen, a mixture of curiosity and resentment bubbling inside her. The next day, Emma decided it was time to take action. She was sitting in the school library during recess, ignoring the chatter of her friend Sophie, who was trying to talk her into going to a party on Saturday. Emma flipped through her algebra book, but her mind was elsewhere. She remembered Claire's phone being left on the kitchen counter while she was showering last night. Emma hadn't meant to snoop, or so she told herself, but curiosity got the better of her. She picked up the phone, punched in the code, and opened her messages. Most were boring: texts from coworkers, reminders from Coach Lucas, short replies to David. But one message from an unknown number with no name made her heart skip a beat. You left your scarf at the studio. Will you come get it? Emma read it 3 times, feeling the blood rush to her temples. Scarf, studio, what the hell? She wanted to answer, to ask who it was, but the sound of Claire's footsteps in the hallway made her quickly lock her phone and pretend to drink water. The message had been bothering her ever since. Someone her mother exchanged emojis with knew where she'd left her scarf. It wasn't a coworker. It wasn't a friend. It was... who? Are you even listening to me? Sophie nudged her, startling her from her thoughts. Her blonde curls bounced as she leaned closer. I'm saying that Zach is going to be at the party. You're in love with him, right? Emma rolled her eyes. I'm not in love with Zach. He's just cute. And anyway, I'm not into parties. She slammed the notebook shut, feeling her irritation growing. Sophie was a good friend, but sometimes her carefree attitude got on her nerves. Oh, come on, what's wrong with you? Sophie narrowed her eyes, but her tone was more curious than hurt. You look like someone stole your cat. Did something happen at home? Emma opened her mouth to wave him off, but stopped. She trusted Sophie, but it seemed too risky to say her suspicions out loud. What if she was wrong? What if it really was just a job, like her mother said? But deep down, Emma knew she wasn't wrong. It's just, Mom's been acting weird, she finally said, lowering her voice. She's always out and about, and when she's home, it's like she's not with us. And I saw stuff on her phone. Sophie's eyes widened, leaning in even closer. Wow, what? Is she texting someone? Like a lover? Quiet. Emma hissed, looking around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. I don't know. It was one message about some scarf and a studio. But she won't tell me anything, and when I ask, she immediately gets angry. Sophie thought, tapping her pencil on the table. Maybe she's just tired. My mom gets mad sometimes, too, when Dad pisses her off. Or, she paused dramatically, she's really having an affair. You have to find out. How will I find out? Emma snorted, but the idea had already grabbed her. I'm not going to follow her like in a spy movie. Why not? Sophie grinned. Take her number again. or ask her directly. If she starts to dodge, then she's definitely hiding something. Emma nodded, but inside she felt a strange feeling, a mixture of determination and fear. She didn't want to think of her mother as someone who would lie. Claire had always been her role model, strong, smart, the one who always knew what to do. But now that image was cracking, and Emma wasn't sure she wanted to see what was behind it. That evening, Emma decided it was time to talk. She waited until Lucas had gone to bed and David was in the study with some blueprints. Claire was in the living room, leafing through a magazine, but her eyes were skimming the pages without stopping. Emma plopped down on the sofa next to him, drawing her knees up to her chest, and took a deep breath. "Mom, can I talk?" she began, trying to keep her voice neutral. Claire put the magazine down and looked at her daughter with a small smile. "Sure, Em. What's wrong? Having trouble with algebra again?" Emma shook her head, feeling the tension building inside her. "No, not with algebra. With you. You've been different lately. Always out and about, and when you're home, it's like, not here." Claire frowned, but her tone remained calm. I'm just busy. Work doesn't always end at 5, you know? And at home, well, there's a lot to do at home, too. You see." "Don't lie," Emma blurted, her voice shaking. She surprised herself with her abruptness, but it was too late to back out. "I know you're not at work. I saw a message on your phone about some scarves and a studio. What studio is this, Mom? And who's texting you?" Claire's face went pale, and for a moment Emma thought her mother was going to scream or cry. But instead Claire sat up straighter, and her voice was cold, almost steely. "You were going through my phone? Emma, that's too much. I have a right to my privacy, don't you think?" The right to privacy. Emma jumped up from the couch, feeling her hurt turn into anger. "What about being honest? Do you think I'm blind? You come home smelling funny, you smile like you have a secret, and then you pretend everything is fine. What are you hiding?" "Enough, Emma." Claire stood up too, her voice rising in a rare outburst. "You don't know what you're talking about. This is adult life, and I have things to do that don't concern you. And going through my phone is just unacceptable." Emma felt tears stinging her eyes, but she clenched her fists, refusing to cry. "Unacceptable? Is it okay to lie to your family? Do you think Dad won't notice? Or Lucas? We're not idiots, Mom." Claire opened her mouth to answer, but stopped. Her face softened, and for a second Emma thought her mother was going to confess, tell her everything. But instead, Claire took a deep breath and said quietly, "I love you, and Dad and Lucas, but you have to trust me. It's just a job, nothing more. Now go to bed, it's late." Emma stood there, looking at her mother, and felt something inside her break. She wanted to scream, to demand the truth, but Claire's words, "trust me," sounded like a wall that could not be penetrated. "Okay," she finally managed to say, turning and walking into her room, slamming the door louder than she had intended. In her room, Emma lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling. The rain outside had gotten heavier, its rhythm the only sound filling the silence. She felt betrayed, but she wasn't sure if it was by her mother, who had lied to her, or by herself, for believing the lie for so long. She pulled out her phone and opened the chat with Sophie, but instead of writing, she simply threw it on the bed. What could she say? That her mother might be cheating on her father, that her perfect family was a facade. Emma thought of David, the way he always smiled when Claire walked into the room, the way he called her sweetheart, with such tenderness that it almost hurt to hear. She thought of Lucas, too young to notice anything but his toys and cartoons. And she thought of herself, wishing everything would go back to normal, for her mother to just be her mother again, not this stranger with secrets. But somewhere deep inside, Emma knew there was no turning back. She could see the crack in their lives, and now that crack would only grow. She closed her eyes, feeling a tear roll down her cheek, and promised herself that she would find out the truth, no matter the cost. Claire, left in the living room, sank down on the sofa, her head in her hands. Her heart was pounding, and Emma's words were ringing in her ears. You think Daddy won't notice? She hated herself for how sharply she had answered her daughter, for how easily she had lied. But the truth was too hard, too devastating. She couldn't tell Emma about Matt, about his studio, about how his touch made her feel alive. She couldn't admit that every time she came home, she left a part of herself there, in that chaotic world of color and passion. Claire looked down at her hand, where her wedding ring still glittered. She twisted it, feeling the cool metal against her skin, and thought of David. He had been everything she had ever wanted: reliable, loving, a man who had designed their life with the same precision with which he had drawn up his engineering plans. But now it felt like a cage, a beautiful, comfortable one, but still a cage. And Matt, with his cheeky smile and freedom, was the key she could neither take nor throw away. She stood up, turned off the light in the living room, and went upstairs, trying not to think about what would happen tomorrow. But deep down, she knew Emma wouldn't stop. Her daughter was too stubborn, too much like her, and that scared Claire more than anything else. Dim streetlights filtered through the fogged-up windows of the old warehouse-turned loft where Matt Crow hosted impromptu parties for his friends' artists, musicians, and dreamers living on the edge. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cigarettes, cheap wine, and oil paint, and loud laughter and snatches of conversation mingled with the low hum of indie music blaring from an old record player. Claire Wilson stood in the corner, clutching a plastic cup of wine that tastes like vinegar. Her silk blouse, chosen with practiced care, seemed out of place among the faded t-shirts and ripped jeans around her. She felt like an outsider, but there was something appealing about that outsider, as if she had entered uncharted territory where the rules of her old life did not apply. Matt was in the center of the room, surrounded by a small crowd. His dark hair fell into his eyes, and his gestures were grand, almost theatrical, as he told a story about how he once tried to sell his painting for a pack of cigarettes. His voice, husky and full of energy, was arresting, and Claire found herself smiling as she watched him. He was a magnet, not just for her, but for everyone in this chaotic, vibrant space. But the longer she watched, the more she noticed the shadows under his eyes, the sharpness in his movements, as if he were balancing on a thin wire between rapture and the abyss. It had been 3 weeks since their first kiss in his studio, and Claire was falling deeper into this new world. She had begun to lie to David with alarming ease. Overtime, client meetings, even a fake conference she was supposed to attend over the weekend. Each excuse was like a brick, building a wall between her real life and the one she had with Matt. These encounters in his studio, in the dive bars of the West Loop, and now at parties like this were like breaths of air for a woman who had been suffocating in her perfect life for too long. But every time she returned home, the guilt settled in her chest, heavy as wet sand. "Are you okay?" Matt's voice broke her out of her thoughts. He came over, holding a bottle of beer, his gaze as sharp as ever. "You look like you're solving the world's problem." Claire smiled, but it was uncertain. It's all a little strange." She gestured around the room, where people were dancing to the music and others were arguing about the meaning of life, waving their arms. "I don't often go to these events." Matt laughed, and his laugh was warm but slightly mocking. "Events, Claire, this isn't your corporate friend's cocktail party. This is life. Real, dirty, alive." He took a step closer, his voice quieter. "You look good here. You're glowing." Claire felt her cheeks warm, but she looked away, afraid to drown in his words. He always spoke like that, with that mixture of brashness and sincerity that made her feel special, wanted, free. But there was something else in his eyes today, a feverish glint she'd seen as he finished another beer. She wanted to ask if he was okay, but instead she just nodded. "Maybe you're right, but I'm still not sure I fit in here." "You fit in," Matt said, touching her hand. His fingers were warm, slightly rough from the paint that seemed to never leave his skin. "You just haven't realized it yet." Claire began spending more and more time with Matt, and every hour stolen from her family felt like walking on thin ice. She became distracted at work, forgetting to send an important report one day and missing a call with a client the next, which angered her boss, who was usually supportive of her successes. At the office, she found herself checking her phone, waiting for a text from Matt, and every time his name popped up, her heart did a somersault. "Meet me at 7? I have an idea for a new painting you should see," he would text, and Claire would agree without thinking, making up another lie for David. At home, she tried to act normal, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Lucas, her 10-year-old son, didn't notice the change. He was too busy with his construction sets and his dreams of a football career. But Emma, with her sharp eyes and teenage suspicion, was a real threat. Claire felt her daughter watching her, as if waiting for her to slip up. Their recent conversation, when Emma had accused her of keeping secrets, had left a bitter taste. Claire hated herself for cutting her off, but the truth was too dangerous, too damaging. One evening, when Claire returned home from another meeting with Matt, she found Emma in the living room. The girl was sitting on the couch, her arms crossed, her face dark as a storm. David was in the kitchen, humming something while washing the dishes, and Lucas was already asleep. Claire tried to walk past, but Emma stopped her with a look. "Late again?" Emma asked, and there was so much sarcasm in her voice that Claire couldn't help but wince. What? The client wanted a new layout at 10 o'clock in the evening. That's enough," Claire said, trying to keep her voice even. She took off her coat and hung it on the hanger, avoiding her daughter's gaze. "I've had a long day. Let's not start." "Not to start?" Emma jumped up, her eyes flashing. "Do you think I can't see that you're lying? You're not even trying to hide it. Dad may not notice, but I'm not blind." Claire felt the blood rush to her temples. She wanted to shout at Emma to shut up, but instead she took a deep breath and said, "You're imagining things too much. I'm working, Em. That's all. Now go to bed, it's late." Emma snorted, but didn't move. "Working? Yeah, sure. Then why do you smell like you've been in a paint cellar? Is your new client an artist?" Claire froze, her heart clenching. She didn't think about the smell, the harsh, solvency scent that had soaked her clothes after hours in Matt's studio. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she shook her head and went upstairs, leaving Emma in the living room. In the bathroom, she turned on the water to drown out the noise of her thoughts and looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was pale, and there were shadows under her eyes, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there in months. Matt made her feel alive, but that life had come at a high price. In Matt's studio, Claire found something that was missing in her suburban home. There, among the scattered brushes, empty bottles, and unfinished canvases, she felt not like a wife, not like a mother, not like a marketer, but like a woman desirable, free, real. Matt looked at her as if she were a work of art he wanted to decipher. Their meetings became more frequent, and each time Claire stepped into his studio, she left her old life behind. But the longer she spent with Matt, the more she noticed cracks in his bohemian facade. One day, as they lay on an old mattress abandoned in the corner of the studio, surrounded by the smell of paint and sex, Matt suddenly went silent. His hand, stroking her hair, stopped, and he stared at the ceiling, as if he saw something there that Claire couldn't see. "What is it?" she asked, raising herself up on her elbow. His face was tense, and there was a shadow in his eyes that she couldn't decipher. "Nothing," he answered too quickly, but his voice was hoarse, as if he'd swallowed something bitter. "It's just. Sometimes I think that all this, the paintings, the parties, all this freedom is just a way to escape from myself." Claire frowned, trying to figure out what he meant. Run away? From what? Matt turned to her, and his smile was bitter, almost painful. "From everything. From debt, from the past, from never being who I wanted to be. Do you know how many of my paintings have actually sold? 3. In 2 years. The rest are just scribbles I call art, so I don't feel like a failure." Claire felt a pang of disappointment. She had seen Matt as the embodiment of freedom, a man who lived his life the way he wanted, without regard for the rules. But now she saw the other side, the insecurity that hid behind his cheeky smile, and the self-destructiveness that showed in his late-night drinking binges and mood swings. He wasn't just an artist living for passion, he was a man who, like her, was looking for salvation but didn't know where to find it. "You're not a loser," she said, touching his cheek. "Your paintings, they're alive. They make you feel. That's something." Matt looked at her, and for a moment his gaze softened. "You say that because you see something in me that isn't there, but I'm not complaining. I like the way you look at me." Claire wanted to protest, but he kissed her, and it was deeper than usual, like he was trying to hold on to this moment. She responded, but there was a growing feeling in her chest that she was playing with fire, and that fire could burn not just her, but everything she loved. At home, Claire tried to be her old self, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. She missed a parent-teacher conference at Lucas's school, forgot to sign Emma up for the photography class she wanted so much. David was patient as always, but even he was starting to ask questions. "Are you okay, Claire?" he asked one night over dinner when she glanced at her phone for the third time that evening. "You seem distant." "It's okay," she said, forcing a smile. "Just a lot of work. New campaign, you know." David nodded, but his gaze was hard, as if he were trying to see what she was trying to hide. Claire felt like the lies were like a second skin, but to peel them away would be to destroy everything. She couldn't tell him about Matt, how his touch made her heart beat faster, how his world of chaos and passion was like oxygen to her. But she also couldn't ignore the pain she saw in Emma's eyes, or the warmth in David's voice when he told her good night. One night, lying in bed next to David, Claire felt her throat tighten with tears. She wanted to turn to him, to hold him, to confess everything, but the fear was too strong. Instead, she closed her eyes and thought of Matt, his studio, his voice, the way he made her feel alive. But now there was anxiety mixed in with that feeling. Matt wasn't just a salvation, he was the abyss she was falling into, and she didn't know if it had a bottom. Friday nights in the Wilson household were usually a time of warmth and comfort. The smell of pizza, Lucas's laughter, arguments over which family movie to watch. But today, as David Wilson walked into the living room carrying pizza boxes from their favorite corner pizza place, the air in the house felt heavy, as if a storm was about to begin. Lucas was sitting on the floor, fiddling with a new Lego model, humming, but Emma, nestled in the corner of the couch with her headphones on, didn't even look up. Claire, who usually organized these evenings with an easy smile, stood by the window, looking out onto the darkening street, where the streetlights had already come on, casting soft circles of light on the wet pavement. Her posture, arms crossed, shoulders tense, was as distant as her thoughts. David set the boxes on the coffee table and wiped his hands on his jeans, trying not to notice the silence in the room weighing on him. He was a man used to fixing things. The bridges he designed at work, Lucas's broken toys, even minor family squabbles. But this was beyond his usual tools. In recent weeks, he had felt Claire slipping away from him, not physically, but emotionally, as if she were here but somewhere else. Her smiles were fewer, her answers shorter, and the gaze he had once considered his beacon now avoided him. "Anchovy pizza for Lucas, a margarita for Emma, and our good old pepperoni," David said, trying to sound his usual cheerful voice. He glanced at Claire, hoping she would respond, but she only nodded, not taking her eyes off the window. "Cool, Dad." Lucas jumped up, opening the box and immediately grabbing a piece, not caring that the cheese was in long strings. "Can I have two?" "Just don't eat on the carpet, champ," David replied, patting his son on the head. He turned to Emma, who still had her headphones on. Are you in?" Emma gave him a quick, teenage weary look and reluctantly pulled out one earbud. "I'm not hungry," she muttered, turning back to her phone. David sighed, feeling irritation mingle with worry. Emma had always been stubborn, but lately her withdrawal had become almost palpable. He wanted to ask what was wrong, but decided now was not the time. Instead, he walked over to Claire, touching her shoulder. "Claire, are you going to eat? Or are you going to tell her you're on a diet again?" She turned around, and her smile was so forced that David felt a pang in his chest. "Yes, of course now," she said, but her voice was empty, like an echo in an abandoned house. She walked to the table, picked up a slice of pizza, and sat down, but her gaze slid around the room, avoiding him. David watched her, his mind spinning from a conversation they'd had at work that day. His coworker, Tom, a man with an easygoing smile and a penchant for gossip, had casually mentioned seeing Claire at a coffee shop in the West Loop a few days earlier. She was with some guy, Tom had said, not noticing the tension in David's expression. Young guy in a leather jacket. Probably a client, huh? David had waved it off, joked that Claire was always surrounded by people because of her job, but Tom's words had stuck in his head like a splinter. He hadn't wanted to suspect her Claire, his Claire, who had been his rock for 16 years. But now, looking at her distant face, he couldn't ignore the doubts that were growing like weeds. After dinner, when Lucas had fled to his room and Emma had disappeared into hers, David decided it was time to talk. Claire was washing dishes in the kitchen, though the dishwasher stood nearby, ready to take over. She did so in silence, the sound of water running from the faucet, the only thing that broke the silence. David leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms, and just looked at her for a few seconds. Her brown hair, usually neatly done, was now out of its bun, and the shirt she tucked into her jeans was slightly wrinkled. She looked tired, but there was something about her tiredness that he couldn't place, not just physical, but something deep, as if she was carrying a burden he didn't know about. "Claire," he began, trying to keep his voice calm, "we need to talk." She froze, but did not turn around. Her hands continued to scrub the plate, although it was now clean. "About what?" she asked, and there was caution in her tone, as if she were preparing for a blow. David took a step closer, feeling his heart beat faster. "About you. About us. You've been different lately. I don't know what's going on, but I feel like you're not here." Claire finally turned, drying her hands on a towel. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes, the same gray-green eyes he'd fallen in love with 20 years ago, were worried. "David, I'm just tired. Work, kids, home. You know how it is." "I know," he agreed, but his voice was firmer. "But it's not just tiredness, Claire. You come home late, you barely talk to us, you—" He hesitated, hesitating to say the words that were spinning in his head. But the splinter that had lodged itself in his head after Tom's words would not let him rest. "Tom saw you in a cafe this week, with some guy. Who was it?" Claire tensed, and for a split second her face looked as if she'd been slapped. But she quickly regained her composure, and her voice became sharp, almost accusing. "Are you serious? Are you following me now? Or is Tom your spy?" "I'm not spying," David replied, feeling his irritation growing. "I'm just asking. You're my wife, Claire. If there's something going on, I want to know." "Nothing is happening." Her voice rose to a scream, and she threw the towel on the table. "It was a client, David. The client I was discussing a project with. God, do you really think I have time for anything else? I'm drowning in work, in this life, in your expectations, and you're accusing me of something that doesn't exist." Her words were like a blow, and David felt his own anger recede, replaced by pain. "My expectations?" he asked, lowering his voice. "Claire, all I do is try to support you. I work, I take care of the kids, I try to make things work for us. But it's like you don't want to be here." Claire opened her mouth to respond, but instead turned away, looking out the window above the sink. Her shoulders were shaking, and David wasn't sure if she was crying or just trying to contain herself. He wanted to go over, hug her, tell her everything would be okay, but something about her silence stopped him. This wasn't just a fight, it was a rift growing between them, and he didn't know how to fix it. "I don't want to fight," he said finally, his voice tired. "I just want you to be honest with me. If something's wrong, tell me. We'll figure it out." Claire nodded, but didn't turn around. "Okay," she said quietly. "I just need time." David looked at her for a few more seconds, hoping she would say something that would restore his confidence. But she remained silent, and he left the kitchen, his heart clenching with a fear he didn't want to admit. Emma had heard their conversation from outside her room upstairs. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but her parents' voices, soft at first and then louder, carried through the thin walls. Every word Claire said, every accusation she made about David, was like a knife stabbing her in the chest. Emma knew her mother was lying. She could see it in her eyes, in the way she looked away when Emma asked about her late nights. And now, hearing Claire scream at her father, Emma felt her world crumbling. She went back to her room and closed the door, trying not to slam it. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone and opened a chat with Sophie, her best friend. Mom is lying again. Dad asked where she was, and she yelled at him. I hate her, she wrote, but then deleted the message without sending it. Sophie was a good friend, but she wouldn't understand. Her parents had divorced 2 years ago, and for Sophie, the adults' arguments were just background noise. For Emma, it was a disaster. Emma lay down on her bed, pulled her knees up to her chest, and stared at the ceiling, where the stars she'd glued on when she was 7 still glowed. She remembered Claire helping her glue them on, laughing when one fell on her nose. Her mother had been different than warm, real, the one who always knew how to make Emma feel safe. Now that mother was gone, and in her place was a woman who lied and yelled and treated her family like they were a burden. Emma felt tears stinging her eyes, but she clenched her teeth, refusing to cry. She hated Claire for what she was doing to their family, but she hated herself even more for still loving her. She wanted to storm into the kitchen to scream the truth in her mother's face, but the fear that the truth would be worse than she suspected stopped her. Instead, she put on her headphones and turned up the music, loud enough to drown out the voices in her head that whispered that her family would never be the same. The next day, the tension in the house was almost palpable. Lucas was as absorbed in his own work as ever, but even he noticed that his parents were barely speaking. At breakfast, Claire sat with a cup of coffee, scrolling through her phone, and David read the newspaper silently, though his eyes did not move from line to line. Emma ate toast, trying not to look at them, but her silence was louder than any words. After breakfast, David left for work earlier than usual, and Claire announced that she had to stop by the office, even though it was Saturday. Emma watched her go from the window and saw her mother glance at her phone as she got into the car, smiling at her phone in a way Emma had never seen at home. It wasn't just a smile, it was an expression of anticipation, as if Claire were going on a date rather than to work. Emma clenched her fists, anger bubbling in her chest. She knew she had to do something, but she didn't know what. Meanwhile, Claire was driving, not to the office, but to the West Loop, to Matt's studio. She told herself that this would be the last time, that she just wanted to clear her feelings, but deep down she knew she couldn't stop. Matt was like a drug, dangerous, but giving her something she couldn't find at home. His world of chaos and passion was the opposite of her life, and in that contrast she felt alive. But even in the car, listening to the radio, Claire couldn't shake the memory of her conversation with David the night before. His voice, full of pain, his eyes, searching for the truth, haunted her. She hated herself for yelling at him, for using his love as a shield. But confessing would mean destroying everything: their marriage, their family, their life. And Claire, despite her guilt, wasn't ready to let Matt go, wasn't ready to go back to the version of herself that was suffocating in her routine. That evening, when Claire returned home, she found David in the living room. He was sitting in a chair with a glass of whiskey, which was rare. David only drank on special occasions. His face was tired, but there was a determination in his eyes that Claire had not seen before. "We need to finish this conversation," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Claire, I don't want to live in a house where we pretend everything is okay. If you're unhappy, tell me. If I've done something wrong, tell me. But don't lie to me." Claire felt her throat tighten. She wanted to tell him she loved him, that everything would be okay, but the words stuck. Instead, she sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap, and said, "I'm not lying, David. It's just hard. I don't know how to explain it." "Try," he said, and there was such pain in his voice that Claire wanted to cry. "Because I don't recognize you. And Emma. She feels it too. She looks at you like you're a stranger." The mention of Emma was like a punch to the gut. Claire closed her eyes, feeling the tears welling up, but she clenched her teeth, refusing to let them come. "I love you," she said at last, and it was true, but not the whole truth. I just need to get myself sorted out. David looked at her for a long time, and there was a weight in his silence that Claire couldn't bear. Finally, he stood up, put his glass on the table, and said, I hope you can figure this out, Claire, because I don't know how much longer I can wait. He went upstairs, leaving her in the living room, where the silence was louder than any scream. Claire sat there, staring at her empty glass, feeling the cracks in her marriage widen, threatening to swallow up everything she loved. But even then, part of her was thinking about Matt, about his studio, about the way he made her feel alive. And that part scared her more than anything else. Morning light streamed through the blinds of David Wilson's office, turning the dust motes in the air into tiny sparks. He sat at his desk in the office, surrounded by the bridge plans and diagrams that usually gave him a sense of control. But today, the pencil in his hand lay motionless on the paper, his gaze fixed on nothing. In front of him, on his phone, glowed a photograph he had received last night from an old friend, Ben, whom he hadn't seen in years. Look who I spotted in the cafe the other day. Your Claire is still as pretty as ever, the message read, full of innocent enthusiasm. But the image attached to the text was a punch to the solar plexus. In the photo, Claire sat at a table in a cozy cafe, her face lit up by a soft smile that David hadn't seen at home in months. Opposite her was a man young, with dark hair and a casual posture, wearing a leather jacket. His hand was on the table, too close to Claire's, and there was something about the way he looked at her that made David feel out of place. This wasn't a client. This wasn't a colleague. This was someone who looked at his wife as if she belonged to him. David reread Ben's message, hoping it was a mistake, that it wasn't Claire, but someone like her. But he knew her too well, her brown hair, slightly curled at the ends, the way she tilted her head when she laughed. It was her. And that truth was more than he could bear. He didn't answer Ben, not knowing what to say. Instead, he turned off the screen of his phone and stared at the drawing in front of him, but the lines and numbers were blurring, as if someone had erased them with an eraser. He didn't want to believe that Claire would cheat on him. She was his rock, his partner, the mother of their children. But the last few weeks, her distance, her late returns, her abruptness in her responses had formed a puzzle he could no longer ignore. David felt a pain growing in his chest, not sharp but dull, as if someone were slowly squeezing the air out of him. He didn't know what to do with this pain, how to express it. Scream, make a scene, it wasn't in his nature. David had always been a man who fixed, not a man who broke. But how could you fix something that was already broken? Meanwhile, the Wilson household was in the usual Saturday morning bustle. Lucas was at the kitchen table, eagerly devouring waffles, pouring syrup over them until it dripped onto the tablecloth. Emma was perched on a footstool, scrolling through her phone, ignoring her brother's attempts to start a conversation. Claire was at the stove, making coffee, but her movements were jerky, as if she were trying to distract herself from the thoughts that were bothering her. She didn't know David had seen the photo, but she felt her world growing more and more fragile. The lies she had been weaving to hide her encounters with Matt were becoming more complex, and every glance from Emma, every question from David, was like a crack in glass ready to shatter. "Mom, you forgot about my workout again," Lucas said, looking up from his waffles. His freckled face was serious, but not angry. "It's at 2, not 3. Claire winced, spilling coffee on the counter. "Oh, sorry, Lou. 2, exactly. I'll remember." She grabbed a rag to wipe up the spill, but her hands were shaking slightly. Emma looked up from her phone, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Remember? Like yesterday, you remembered promising to help me with my biology project." Her voice was quiet, but full of venom. "Or were you too busy with your work?" Claire felt the blood rush to her temples. She wanted to answer gently, to reassure her daughter, but anger was already boiling inside her, not at Emma, but at herself, at this trap she had gotten herself into. "Emma, I said I'd help. I've just had a hard day. Please don't start." "Don't start?" Emma snorted, leaning back in her chair. "You started this, Mom. You're not even trying to pretend you care." Lucas looked at his sister, then at his mother, his brows furrowing. Come on. Mom, she's just mad because Zach didn't answer her in chat. Shut up, Lucas. Emma shot her brother a look that made him go silent, staring at his plate. She stood up, grabbed her phone, and headed for the door. Do whatever you want. I don't care. Claire wanted to call out to her, but the words caught in her throat. She could feel Emma's hurt eyes burning into hers, as if her daughter could see right through her lies. Claire turned to Lucas, who was looking at her with concern, and forced herself to smile. It's okay, Lou. Emma's just a teenager. Want some more waffles? Lucas nodded, but his enthusiasm had faded. Claire felt the guilt that had become her constant companion grow even heavier. She had lied not only to David, but to her children, and every day those lies took away a piece of who she was. David returned home earlier than usual, but instead of joining his family, he went into his office on the ground floor and closed the door. He didn't want to see Claire, didn't want to hear her voice, which now seemed alien to him. The photo Ben had sent sat on his phone like a mine, ready to explode. He opened it again and again, each time hoping to see something different, but each time it was Claire, smiling at a man he didn't know. David was not a dramatic person. He had grown up in a household where problems were solved quietly, behind closed doors, and that habit had stayed with him all his life. But now he felt something new growing inside him, not anger, but a deep, almost physical ache. He thought back to his early years with Claire, dancing in the kitchen to old songs, her laughing at his terrible jokes, dreaming of the future on the porch of their first house. Where was Claire now? And who was this man who made her smile in a way she had never smiled at him? He thought about asking her directly, showing her the photograph, demanding the truth. But something stopped him, of fear that the truth would be worse than his suspicions. He didn't want to see Claire lie to his face, or worse, admit it. David dropped his head into his hands, feeling the fatigue wash over him like a wave. He didn't know how to live with this knowledge, but he knew he couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. Claire, unaware of the photo, continued to teeter on the edge of two worlds. In the morning, she sent Matt a text asking if he was free that evening. His response, a short, "Come to the studio, I'm working on something new," made her heart beat faster. She told David she'd be working late, making up a story about a client meeting that had dragged on. The lies came so easily to her that it was frightening, but she couldn't stop. Matt was like a magnet, drawing her toward a life of passion and freedom she hadn't felt in so long. Matt's studio was the usual chaos, the smell of paint, scattered brushes, half-drunk cans of coffee. He stood at his easel, his hands stained blue and yellow, his face aglow with the kind of feverish energy that both terrified and fascinated Claire. "Look," he said, stepping back from the canvas. "It's you." Claire stepped closer and froze. There was an abstract figure on the canvas, a woman woven from bright brush strokes of red, gold, and blue. There was no face, but there was something in her posture, the set of her shoulders, that made Claire feel seen. "Is that me?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Who else?" Matt smiled, but there was a hint of weariness in his smile. "You're like a storm, Claire. Beautiful, but dangerous. I can't stop thinking about you." His words were a balm, but there was a bitterness to them. Claire knew that Matt saw her not as just a woman, but as an idea, a projection of his own desires. And yet she could not take her eyes off the canvas, feeling how his art made her more than she was. They spent the evening together, talking, laughing, touching each other with the greed that comes with knowing time is limited. But as Claire left, she noticed an empty bottle of whiskey on the table where it had not been before, and it left a troubling residue in her soul. When Claire got home, she found David in the living room. He was sitting on the sofa, staring at the switched-off television, and his face was so still that for a moment she was startled. "David," she called, taking off her coat. "Are you okay?" He turned slowly to face her, his gaze heavy, as if he were seeing her for the first time. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice quiet but with steel in it. Claire felt her heart tighten. She was used to his questions, used to lying, but there was something in his tone today that made her wary. "At work," she said, trying to sound confident. The meeting ran late. I told you so. David nodded, but his eyes never left hers. Meeting, he repeated, and there was so much pain in the word that Claire wanted to turn away. You've been working a lot lately, Claire. She wanted to answer, to justify herself, but his gaze stopped her. It wasn't anger, not accusation, but something worse, disappointment. David stood up and walked past her without another word. Claire was left standing in the living room, feeling her world crumble. She didn't know he'd seen the photograph, but she felt that something had changed, that her lies were no longer holding their family together. Emma, lying in her room, could hear her parents talking or not talking. She knew her father suspected something, but she didn't know what. Her own pain, mixed with anger, made her silent, withdrawn. She didn't want to talk to Claire, didn't want to see her fake smiles. But she also couldn't talk to David, afraid that her words would destroy what was left of their family. Emma took out the notebook where she sometimes wrote down her thoughts and began to write. I hate it when she lies. I hate that Dad pretends everything is okay. I hate that I can't do anything. The words were uneven, written with such force that the pencil tore the paper. She slammed the notebook shut and threw it on the floor, feeling tears sting her eyes. Emma didn't know how to live in this house where everyone kept their own secrets, but she knew she couldn't pretend nothing was happening. Claire stood in the shower, letting the hot water wash away the smell of paint and whiskey that had soaked into her skin. She tried not to think about David, about the way he looked at her, about the way he kept silent, but it was impossible. She felt her life falling apart, like every choice she made being with Matt, lying to David, ignoring Emma's pain brought her closer to the edge. But even as it all fell apart, she couldn't stop herself. Matt was her salvation, her escape, and the thought of giving him up was unbearable. She stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was beautiful, but her eyes were full of fear. Claire knew her world was falling apart, but she didn't know how to save it. And in that moment, standing in the quiet of the bathroom, she thought for the first time that maybe there was nothing left to save. The Chicago evening hummed outside Matt Crow's studio, where neon signs mingled with the cold glow of the moon shining through the dusty panes. Inside, amid the chaos of canvases, empty bottles, and scattered brushes, there was a tense silence. Claire Wilson stood against the peeling plaster, her arms crossed as if she were trying to keep herself from falling. Across the room, Matt paced, his movements jerky, almost feverish, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and desperation. On the table between them sat a half-empty bottle of bourbon, and the smell of the spirit permeated the air, adding to the sense of impending disaster. You don't understand, Claire, Matt said, running his hand through his hair, which had long since lost all semblance of order. I can't just sit here and wait for you to decide what you want. I thought you were different, that you saw me, and not just another way to escape your boring life. His words cut like a knife, and Claire felt something inside her tighten. She looked at him, at his dark eyes, burning with a mixture of pain and accusation, at his clenched fists, at the mess around him that now seemed not romantic but frightening. Matt, whom she had once seen as the embodiment of freedom, now looked like a man losing control of himself, of his life, of her. It's not about running away, Matt, she said, trying to keep her voice steady even though she was shaking inside. I tried. I thought I could be myself with you. But I can't. You're not who I thought you were. Matt stopped, and his gaze grew heavy, almost menacing. Not the one? Who am I, Claire? A failed artist who's only good for your fantasies. You come here, drink my wine, sleep with me, and then go back to your perfect husband and kids like nothing ever happened. Am I the one, or are you just playing your game? Claire felt tears stinging her eyes, but she clenched her teeth, refusing to let them come. What he said was cruel, but true. She had used Matt, his studio, his chaotic world, as a refuge from her life, from her routine, from herself. But now that refuge was crumbling, and she could see that Matt was no savior, but a man as lost as she was. His emotional outbursts, his self-destructive tendencies, his late-night drinking bouts, his casually mentioned debts, His inability to finish a single painting were not romance, but warnings she was ignoring. "I'm not playing," she said quietly, but with a strength she didn't expect from herself. "But I can't do this anymore. It's destroying me, Matt. And you too. We have to stop." Matt looked at her, and for a moment his face softened, as if he wanted to reach out, to hold her. But instead he laughed, a bitter, ragged laugh that echoed off the walls. "Stop? Now? After everything? You think you can just walk away and pretend it never happened?" He took a step closer, and Claire instinctively took a step back. "You're not the same, Claire. You're not going to go back to your perfect life, no matter how hard you try." His words were like a blow, and Claire felt her resolve waver. She knew he was right. She was no longer the woman who cooked family dinners and smiled at office parties. But she also knew she couldn't stay here, in this world that promised freedom but delivered only chaos. "Goodbye, Matt," she said, picking up her bag and heading for the door. Her voice was even, but inside she was screaming. Matt didn't stop her. He just stood there, watching her go, his silence louder than any words. As Claire stepped outside, the cold wind hit her face, and she felt the tears finally streaming down her cheeks. She wasn't crying for Matt, she was crying for herself, for looking to him for a salvation he couldn't give, for throwing her life away for an illusion. Coming home was like stepping into another world, familiar but foreign. The Wilson house, with its white walls, flowers on the porch, and the smell of freshly baked bread, seemed like the set for a play in which Claire no longer knew her role. She entered quietly, hoping that everyone would be asleep, but the light was on in the living room. David was sitting on the sofa, an envelope on the table in front of him, and his face looked as if he hadn't slept in days. Emma stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes full of anger meeting Claire's. "Where have you been?" David asked, his voice quiet, but with a weariness that had been building for months. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the envelope, as if there was something in it he was afraid to touch. Claire felt her heart sink. She wanted to lie, like she had a dozen times, but something in his tone, his posture, stopped her. "I was with a friend," she said, but the words sounded false even to her. Emma snorted, her voice sharp as a blade. "A friend? Seriously, Mom? Do you think we're idiots?" She took a step forward, and Claire saw hurt in her eyes as well as anger. "I know you're lying. Dad knows. Everyone knows except Lucas because he's little. But even he'll figure it out soon enough." Claire opened her mouth to protest, but David held up a hand, stopping them both. He finally looked at her, and his blue eyes, usually so warm, were as cold as the winter sky. "Claire, stop," he said, his voice shaking. "I saw the picture of you with him in a cafe." He nodded at the phone on the table. "Ben sent it a couple of weeks ago. I didn't want to believe it, but you left me no choice." Claire felt the ground shift beneath her. The photograph. She remembered that day in the cafe with Matt, their laughter, his hand touching hers. She didn't think anyone could see them, that anyone could capture that moment. "David, it's not what you think," she began, but her voice was weak, a whisper. "Not that." David stood up, his face a mixture of pain and disbelief. "Then what is it, Claire? Explain it to me, because I don't understand. I don't understand why my wife, the mother of my children, lies to me, goes out at night, and comes back looking like I'm a stranger to her." Claire wanted to answer, but the words caught in her throat. She looked at Emma, whose eyes were full of tears, and felt her own heart breaking. "Emma, she began, but her daughter cut her off. "Don't, Mom," Emma said, her voice rough with suppressed sobs. "I don't want to hear your excuses. You ruined everything." She turned and walked upstairs, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Claire stood there, feeling her world crumble. She looked at David, hoping to find some glimmer of forgiveness in his eyes, but there was only pain. He picked up the envelope from the table and handed it to her. "These are divorce papers," he said quietly. "I don't want to live a lie anymore, Claire. I can't." She took the envelope, its weight in her hands like a death sentence. "David, please," she whispered, but he shook his head. "I loved you," he said, his voice breaking. "I still love you, but I can't trust you, and I can't watch you destroy our children." He walked away, leaving her in the living room, where the silence was louder than any scream. Claire sank down on the couch, clutching the envelope, and felt tears streaming down her face. She hadn't cried when she'd broken up with Matt. She hadn't cried when she'd lied to David. But now, holding the papers that meant the end of her family, she couldn't stop. She cried not just for David or Emma, but for herself, for the woman who'd lost herself in pursuit of an illusion. The next day, Claire packed her suitcase and moved into a small apartment she had rented in the city center. She told Lucas she was going away on a business trip, unable to bear his questions, but Emma refused to even say goodbye. David was polite, but his coldness was worse than any anger. Claire felt like a ghost, sliding through the wreckage of her life, unsure how to piece it together. In the apartment, with its bare walls and creaky floors, she sat on the couch, looking out the window at the city, its bright, indifferent life. She thought of Matt, of his studio, of how she had seen freedom in it, but found only chaos. She thought of David, of his kindness, of the way he looked at her with a love she did not appreciate. And she thought of Emma, of her anger, of her pain, which was a mirror of her own. Claire pulled out her phone and opened her messages. There was the last message from Matt, sent after their fight. "You made your choice. Good luck." She deleted it, as if it could erase the last months, but she knew that was impossible. She had destroyed her family not because of Matt, but because of herself, because of her fear of being who she was, because of her inability to find herself without hurting others. She curled up on the couch and closed her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about Matt. She wasn't thinking about David. She wasn't thinking about Emma. She was thinking about herself, who she had become, who she wanted to be. And in that silence, in the wreckage of her life, she felt a tiny spark of hope, not for the past to return, but for a new beginning. David, left behind, tried to keep his cool for the sake of the children. Lucas asked questions he didn't know how to answer, and Emma withdrew even more, spending her days in her room with headphones on. He felt guilty, as if his decision to file for divorce had been a betrayal, but he knew he couldn't live a lie. He loved Claire, but love couldn't heal the wounds she had inflicted. Emma sat in her room, writing in her diary, pouring out her anger and pain. She hated her mother, but she missed her, the Claire who read her stories, who laughed at her jokes. She didn't know how to forgive, but she knew she couldn't forget. And in that pain, she felt older than her 14 years, as if adulthood had come too soon. Claire, in her empty apartment, knew that going back to her old life was impossible. She had lost Matt, she had lost David, she had lost Emma. But perhaps in that loss, she could find herself not a wife, not a mother, not a lover, but simply Claire. And that thought, fragile as the first snow, was the only thing that kept her from falling. Claire's small apartment on the edge of downtown Chicago smelled of fresh paint and damp, as if the walls hadn't yet gotten used to a new tenant. The furniture was sparse, a tattered couch bought at a garage sale, a wooden table with scratches from previous owners, and a bed with a mattress that creaked with every movement. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting patterns on the floor like cracks, just like the ones that now defined Claire Wilson's life. She sat at the table, cupping her hands around a mug of cold coffee, and stared at the blank wall, devoid of photographs, paintings, or traces of her past life. The silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic, was as heavy as her thoughts. It had been a week since she had left the Wilsons' house, leaving behind a family she had destroyed with her own hands. The suitcase she had packed in a hurry was still standing by the door, half unpacked, as if Claire wasn't sure whether she would stay or run away again. But there was nowhere to run. Matt Crow, with his chaotic world and toxic passion, had disappeared from her life, leaving only the bitter taste of disappointment. David, with his quiet pain and determination to end their marriage, was now just a voice on the other end of the phone, discussing play dates with the kids. And Emma, whose betrayal-filled eyes haunted Claire's dreams, wasn't answering her texts or calls. Lucas, the only one who still spoke to her, did so with childish caution, as if he were afraid she would disappear forever. Claire set her mug down and rubbed her temples, feeling the headache that had become her constant companion throb in time with her heart. She hadn't cried since the night David handed her the divorce papers, but the tears seemed to have dried up, leaving an emptiness inside that she didn't know how to fill. Her job, once her pride, now seemed pointless. She had taken time off, citing personal circumstances, and wasn't sure if she'd return. Friends, including Linda, had called a couple of times, but their sympathy was like salt in the wound. Claire didn't want pity, she wanted answers. Why had she ruined everything? Why had she sought salvation in Matt, knowing he wasn't what she needed? And why, even now, alone, did she not feel free? The only decision she had made this week was to book an appointment with a therapist. She had found Dr. Alice Martin's name online, drawn by reviews of her empathetic approach and good listening skills. Claire didn't believe that talking to a stranger could change anything, but she needed something to hold on to. Today was her first session, and she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to gather her strength. Her reflection pale, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, looked like a portrait of a woman who had lost herself. She had put on a simple gray top and jeans, foregoing makeup, as if she wanted to come to Dr. Martin as she was, broken but honest. Alice Martin's office was in an old brick building in Lincoln Park, with windows overlooking the street where people hurried under umbrellas to escape the drizzle. It was warm inside, smelling of lavender and books, and the soft light of the lamps gave Claire a sense of comfort that she hadn't felt in a long time. Dr. Martin, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and kind but penetrating eyes, sat in a chair with a notepad in her lap. Her smile was unobtrusive, but Claire felt as if she were under a microscope under her gaze. "Tell me what brings you here, Claire," Alice began, her voice soft, but with a note that made it impossible to avoid answering. Claire sat on the couch, fiddling with the hem of her sleeve, silent. She didn't know where to begin. With Matt? With David? With Emma? Or with the emptiness that had settled inside her all those years ago? Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke, and the words she had been holding back for so long poured out like water from a cracked dam. "I destroyed my family," she said, her voice hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken out loud in a long time. "I cheated on my husband. I lied to him, to my children, to myself. I thought it would make me happy, that I would find myself, but now I'm alone, and I don't know who I am." Alice nodded without interrupting, and her silence was such that Claire wanted to go on. She talked about Matt, his studio, his paintings, the way he made her feel alive. She talked about David, his kindness, his pain, the way she had betrayed his trust. She talked about Emma, whose anger was like a mirror showing her how far she had fallen. And finally, she talked about herself, the feeling of emptiness that had been growing inside her for years, the fear that she would live her life without knowing what she wanted. "I thought Matt was the answer," she said, looking down at her hands, where the wedding ring she couldn't take off still glittered. "But he was just an escape. I was running from routine, from responsibility, from not knowing how to be happy, and now I've lost everything." Alice put down her notebook and leaned in a little closer. "Claire, you talk about running away, but let's look deeper. What exactly were you trying to leave behind? What in your life made you feel this emptiness?" Claire froze. The question was simple, but it touched on something she'd been avoiding for years. She thought about her life before Matt, a career that was successful but draining, a marriage that was stable but lacking in passion, a motherhood she loved but that sometimes felt like a cage. I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe I was just tired of being who everyone expected me to be. A wife, a mother, a professional. I did everything right, but inside, there was nothing inside." Alice nodded, and there was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. "Sometimes we build a life that looks perfect on the outside, but doesn't match how we feel inside. And when that emptiness becomes unbearable, we look for ways to fill it. For you, that was Matt. But as you said, he didn't solve the problem. Because the problem isn't on the outside, it's on the inside." Claire felt her throat tighten. She knew Alice was right, but the truth was painful, like an open wound. "Then what do I do?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "How do I find myself when I don't even know where to start?" "It's a long road," Alice replied, her tone gentle but firm. "But it starts with honesty. With yourself, with others. You've already taken the first step by coming here. Now you need to give yourself time to figure out what you want, not what's expected of you." Claire nodded, but doubt raged inside her. Time? She didn't have time. Her family was broken. Her daughter hated her. Her husband wanted a divorce. But Alice's words, so simple and calm, were like an anchor, keeping her from drowning in despair. Alice's sessions became the only anchor for Claire in her new life. She saw her twice a week, and each conversation was like a journey into herself, painful but necessary. Alice asked questions that forced Claire to rethink her life. Why was she so afraid of disappointing others? Why had she never told David how she felt? Why had she allowed the emptiness to grow instead of fighting it? The answers came slowly, sometimes through tears, sometimes through silence, but each one was like a puzzle piece she was beginning to piece together. One day, during a session, Alice asked her to describe what she wanted her life to be like in a year. Claire paused, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about David or Emma or Matt. She imagined herself, a woman who knew what she wanted, who wasn't afraid to be imperfect, who might be alone but not lonely. "I want to be free," she said, and her voice was full of wonder, as if she'd just discovered the truth. "Not like Matt, not from something, but inside myself." Alice smiled, and there was something in that smile that gave Claire hope. "Freedom begins with acceptance, Claire. Acceptance of yourself with all your mistakes, with all your fears. You're on that path." But the road was thorny. The evenings in the flat were long and empty. Claire tried to fill them. She read books that had been gathering dust on the shelves for years, tried new recipes, even started writing a journal, pouring out her thoughts on paper. But the loneliness came in waves, especially at night, when she lay in the dark, listening to the creaking of the floor and the distant sounds of the city. She missed Lucas, his laughter, his questions. She missed Emma, even her anger, because anger meant she cared. And she missed David, not their marriage, which had long since become routine, but the man who knew her better than she knew herself. She once wrote Emma a long message, apologizing, explaining, begging to talk, but the answer was silence. She called David to discuss her schedule with Lucas, and his voice, cold and businesslike, was like a blow. "Lucas wants to know when you'll be back," he said, and Claire felt her heart break. "I don't know what to tell him." "Tell him that I love him," she replied, her voice shaking, "and that I'm working on myself." David paused, and Claire could almost hear his pain through the phone. "I hope so, Claire," he said finally, and hung up. For Claire, loneliness became not only a punishment, but also a teacher. She began to notice little things she hadn't seen before. The way the light in her apartment changed from morning to night, the way the neighbor's cat sat on the windowsill, the way the street musician on the corner played the same melody every day. These little things were like threads connecting her to the world she had once ignored. She began to go for walks without planning a route, letting the city lead her. One day, she walked into a small gallery where local artists were exhibiting their work, and for a moment she thought of Matt, but his paintings, full of chaos, no longer seemed beautiful to her. She was not looking for chaos, but harmony with herself, with the world. Her sessions with Alice helped her understand that her infidelity was not just a mistake, but a symptom. She had been looking to Matt for what she could not find in her self-confidence, passion, freedom. But she knew now that these things could not be taken from another. They had to be grown within. It was difficult, sometimes unbearable, but every step, every honest word spoken to Alice, every night spent alone brought her closer to the Claire she wanted to be. One day, on her way home from a session, Claire stopped at a flower stand and bought a bouquet of daisies. She placed them in a glass jar on her desk, and their simple beauty was a promise not that everything would be okay, but that she could do it. She didn't know if Emma and David would forgive her, didn't know if she could earn their trust back, but she knew she had to keep going. Not for them, but for herself. Saturday mornings at the Wilson house began with the smell of pancakes sizzling in a frying pan and the sound of the radio softly playing old Fleetwood Mac hits. David Wilson stood at the stove, wearing a tattered t-shirt and jeans, a wooden spatula in his hand, turning golden circles of dough. Lucas, sitting at the kitchen island, dangled his legs and attempted to build a tower of sugar cubes until he noticed his father was distracted. "Dad, they're burning," he called, pointing to the pan, where one pancake was starting to darken suspiciously at the edges. "Oh shit," David muttered, quickly removing the pan from the heat and transferring the burnt pancake to a plate. "This one's yours, champ," he joked, winking at his son. Lucas rolled his eyes but laughed. "No way, I'm taking the chocolate chip one." David smiled, but his smile was a little strained. He had tried for the children, tried to fill the void left by Claire's departure, but every morning, every family ritual reminded him of what was gone. The house that had once been full of her voice, her organization, her warmth, now seemed too big, too quiet. Lucas, with his boundless energy, was the anchor that kept David afloat, but Emma, his 14-year-old daughter, was a storm he didn't know how to tame. Her anger, her silence, her pain were mirrors of his own, and he felt helpless before them. Emma appeared in the kitchen, still in her pajamas, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. She silently picked up a mug and poured herself some coffee, ignoring her father's gaze. David saw her glance furtively at the empty space at the table where Claire usually sat, and her lips pressed into a thin line. He wanted to say something, to ask how she was, but he knew that any mention of his mother would either cause an outburst or a cold silence. Instead, he simply pushed the plate of pancakes toward her. "Raspberry, your favorite," he said quietly. Emma looked at him, and for a moment her eyes softened. "Thank you," she murmured, sitting down at the table. It was more than she had said in days, and David felt a tiny spark of hope. David tried to keep his composure, focusing on the kids and his work. His days were scheduled down to the minute, driving Lucas to practice in the morning, helping Emma with her homework in the evening, drowning in the bridge plans that demanded his attention at the office. But at night, when the house was quiet, he was alone with the pain that wouldn't go away. The photo Ben had sent of Claire and Matt was still on his phone, though he hadn't opened it since the night he filed for divorce. He didn't want to see her smile at someone else, but he couldn't bring himself to delete the picture, as if it were the last thing he had to connect with her. In recent weeks, David had begun to ask questions he had previously avoided. Why had Claire cheated? What had he done or not done to cause their marriage to fray? He thought back over their life, how proud he had been of her career successes, how he had supported her when she was tired, how he had tried to be a good father. But now he saw what he had missed. Her silent sighs when he talked about work, her staring into space, her attempts to start a conversation that he cut short because he was too busy. He loved Claire, but perhaps he hadn't listened to her, hadn't seen her sinking into the routine that had made him feel comfortable. One evening, after Lucas had gone to bed, David found Emma curled up on the living room sofa with a book. She rarely read, preferring to use her phone, which surprised him. He sat down next to her, holding a mug of tea, and paused, giving her space. Finally, she put the book down and looked at him. "Dad, why didn't you yell at her?" she asked, her voice quiet but full of pain. "When you found out about that guy, why didn't you just say anything?" David felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected the question, but he knew he had to be honest. "Because yelling would have been easier, Em," he said, looking down into his mug. "But it wouldn't have changed anything. I was angry, I was crushed, but I also knew that maybe it was my fault, too. I didn't see that she was hurt, and that was my fault." Emma frowned, her eyes shining with tears. "It's not your fault, Dad. She chose this. She left." Her voice broke, and she turned away, brushing away a tear. David reached out and touched her shoulder. "She made a choice, yes, but that doesn't mean she doesn't love you, or Lucas, or even me. Sometimes people get lost and do things they can't undo." Emma was silent, but she didn't pull away from his hand. It was the first time in months that she had allowed him to be near her, and David felt something soften in him. He knew that Emma missed her mother, despite her anger, and that knowledge was like a bridge between them, fragile but real. Claire, in her small apartment, continued her sessions with Dr. Alice Martin, which had become her lifeline. She learned to talk about her fears, her emptiness, how she had sought in Matt not love, but a way to forget herself. But now she wanted not to forget, but to find Claire who could be honest, who could live without lies. Alice helped her see her mistakes, not as judgments, but as lessons. But each lesson was painful, as if she were peeling off a skin to grow a new one. One day, after a session, Claire sat down at the table and began writing a letter to Emma. She didn't know if her daughter would read it, but she felt she had to try. Her hand shook as she wrote the words, each one like a step through a minefield. Dear Emma, I don't know how to start this letter because no words can make up for what I did. I betrayed you, Lucas, Dad. I lied, I left, I destroyed our family, and I hate myself for it more than you can imagine. I'm not asking you to forgive me, I know I don't deserve it, but I want you to know why I did it. Not for excuses, but for the truth. I lost myself, Em. I was so busy being a good mom, a wife, a professional, that I forgot who I was. And instead of looking for answers, I ran. I found someone who made me feel alive, but it was a lie. He didn't save me, and I didn't save myself. I only hurt the people I love most. I'm working on myself, Em. I'm seeing a therapist. I'm learning to be honest. I don't know if I'll ever be the mom you deserve, but I'm trying. And if you ever want to talk, I'll be here. Not to make excuses, but to listen. I love you, Emma. Always will. Your mom, Claire. Claire sealed the envelope, but did not mail it right away. She held it in her hands as if it were too fragile to be trusted to the post office. Finally, 2 days later, she dropped it in the mailbox, her heart pounding in her throat. She did not expect a reply, but she did hope not for forgiveness, but for a chance. A week later, Claire called David, asking to meet. She didn't know if he would agree, but his voice was calm, almost tired, when he said, "Okay." They met at a cafe near his office, a place that had no connection to their past. David looked older than she remembered. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and there was a heaviness to his posture that hadn't been there before. Claire sat across from him, holding a cup of tea, feeling vulnerable, as if she had taken off all her masks. "I don't want to go back, David," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "Not because I don't love you, but because I know I can't fix what I broke. But I want to be honest. I want to talk to you, to the children, without lying, if you'll let me." David looked at her for a long moment, his eyes full of pain, but also something new understanding, maybe. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Claire," he said at last. "But for Emma and Lucas, I'm willing to try. Not for us, but for them." Claire nodded, feeling tears welling up, but she held them back. "Thank you," she said. "This is more than I deserve." They talked for another half hour about Lucas, his football success, Emma, her school projects. It wasn't the kind of conversation they'd had in their marriage, but it was honest, and it was a start. As they said goodbye, David touched her arm, a light, almost weightless touch, and Claire felt a warmth she hadn't expected. A few weeks later, Emma, to Claire's surprise, responded to her letter. It wasn't a long message, it wasn't an apology, but it was a step. "I got your letter. I'm not ready to talk yet, but I'll think about it," she wrote. Claire reread those words dozens of times, holding the phone so tightly her fingers turned white. It wasn't the end of their breakup, but it was the beginning of something new. Lucas, with his childish openness, insisted that Claire come to the family dinner. "That doesn't mean you'll come back," he said, his seriousness almost comical for a 10-year-old. "But you're our mother, right? Emma wants to too, she just won't say." Emma, to Claire's surprise, actually accepted, though her invitation was muted, almost reluctant. Claire spent the morning before dinner in her apartment, deciding what to wear, as if it might affect how she would be received. She settled on a simple sweater and jeans, foregoing jewelry except for her wedding ring, which she still wore without knowing why. When she pulled up to the Wilsons' house, Her heart was pounding as if she'd been running a marathon. The house looked the same, but different. The flowers on the porch were wilted, and Lucas's bike, usually lying on the lawn, was leaning neatly against the wall. Claire got out of the car, but didn't go to the door. Instead, she stopped at the curb, looking up at the living room windows where the warm light was shining. Through the glass, she could see her family. Lucas waving his arms as he talked, Emma laughing with her head thrown back, and David watching them with a smile that was both tender and tired. Claire felt her eyes fill with tears, but they weren't tears of pain, they were tears of hope. She saw her family, alive, laughing despite everything she had done. They were hurt but not broken, and that gave her strength. She didn't go in, not because she was afraid, but because she knew this was their moment and hers would come. She smiled, wiped her tears, and turned toward the car, feeling something inside her come alive. Claire got behind the wheel but didn't start the engine. She looked at the house again, and at that moment Emma looked up, as if she sensed her gaze. Their eyes met through the window, and Emma didn't look away. It wasn't a smile, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was a look of possibility. Claire nodded, as if to say, "I'm here," and Emma hesitated, then nodded back. Claire started the car and drove back to her apartment, feeling the wind through the open window on her face. She knew that her journey to herself was just beginning, that it would be long, full of mistakes and pain. But for the first time in a long time, she felt that she was going in the right direction. Not toward the past, not toward illusions, but toward herself, to the woman who might be imperfect, but real. And in that fragile but sincere hope was her whole life as it was, and as it could become. Thank you for watching this video. If you have experienced something similar, remember, you are not alone. Time heals, and everyone has their own path, but there is always a way out. Share your thoughts or stories in the comments. Let's support each other without judgment, with sincerity and understanding. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Maybe it will help someone else. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you in the next video. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.